Welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is the very last Prof and a Pint. On behalf of UC Santa Cruz alumni, welcome to our monthly speaker series of what, until recently, of course, has been Prof and a Pint. The series engages a UCSC faculty member in a discussion with you, the local community of the Silicon Valley, with the goal of making us all Renaissance men and women. This is our first online only talk, hopefully not too many more, but it's great to have you join us. As many of you know, we had to pick a new name for this lecture series. Our new name will be Slugs and Steins, Lectures from UC Santa Cruz. In our online poll, 50 of you voted. Slugs and Steins got 17, Sip with a Solar got 14. Thank you for everybody who voted. I'm David, and Mike, another volunteer organizer, is with me tonight. We're both UCSC alumni and spend our days in entrepreneurial companies, Silicon Valley style. Now, while we're not able to be there tonight, we still want to thank our generous host, the Forager in San Jose. They, like many others, but they also are suffering in this pandemic shutdown. So please consider buying gift certificates to help tide them over. That'll be, or the URL to do that will be in an email that you receive after the meeting. Tonight, we raise a virtual pint with Warren Sack. Actually, I hope you have a real one, but we'll share it virtually. Warren is Program Director for Digital Arts and New Media and Professor of Film and Digital Media at UCSC. Warren focuses his research on social computing. He earned his BA from Yale in computer science and psychology, and his master's and PhD from the MIT Media Laboratory. His work has been supported by, among others, the National Science Foundations and 4 art museums around the world, including the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York and the ZKM Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe, Germany. Before UC Santa Cruz, he directed the Social Technologies Research Group at UC Berkeley. Professor Sack recently published a book titled, Are the Arts at the Center of Software's Evolution? Now, given that we're all online, we'll be taking questions this time via the Q&A box. So look towards the bottom of your screen and the Q&A box there. Submit your questions as we go along. And afterwards, when we come to the question period, we'll call on the lucky few of you to pose the question. We'll actually unmute you to be able to pose that and as we call on you. Okay, everybody have their pint? Hold it up. All right. Welcome, Professor Sack.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Mike and Kara and Kristen. Thank you all for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here. Can everybody tell where I am? I'm at the top of the bike path on the Great Meadow. Actually, I am on campus. I live on campus, and my position right now, both physically but also institutionally as chair of Film and Digital Media, the Film and Digital Media Department. I'm happy to answer questions that you might have that don't have anything to do with the talk, but that have to do with what's going on at UC Santa Cruz, tell you as much as I can. So let's see here. I need to start by sharing my screen with you all. There we go. And what I'm going to talk about today is a book, as David mentioned, a book that I recently published with MIT Press. So that's the topic for today. In the book, The Software Arts, I argue that computing grew out of the liberal arts. So this argument will be a provocation for some, especially those who see a bright dividing line between the two cultures of the arts and the sciences. For others, the argument will not seem provocation at all. Important computer scientists have argued that computing is not a science, software is a literature, and computer programming is a kind of essay writing. So for those who see no clear distinction between the arts and the sciences, the software arts will be an old saw with some new teeth. My book was published last year in the MIT Press series, Software Studies. So my talk has two parts. In the first, I'll give a chapter by chapter description of my book manuscript. In the second, I'm going to read some passages from one of the chapters of the book. So the stakes of my book are threefold: pedagogical, industrial, and epistemological. So first, if software is an art, then education needs to change to integrate it into the arts. What do we teach? What do we learn? These are old questions that need to be posed again in a world where basic literacy is not just a matter of Latin, Greek, or English, but of software. Second, if software can be written in the manner of an artist humanist, then new avenues of software production beyond engineering and science may be possible. Third, if software is the new lingua franca, then there are a series of ethical and moral questions that must be pursued in conjunction with this epistemological transformation. What counts as knowledge? For whom and at what cost? So the software arts are the fruit of a coupling of the liberal and the mechanical arts. To demonstrate this argument, the approach taken is partly historical, by tracing the genealogy of computing back to events before or during the initial professionalization of science and engineering. It becomes clear that computing, like science and engineering too, grew out of the arts. So prior to the so-called scientific revolution of the 17th century, there were no scientists, there were no professional organizations of science. Most studies that we would now identify as scientific were conducted under the name of natural philosophy. And natural philosophers most frequently published their works in Latin, in which the word scientia meant something broader than the modern cognate science, something more like the general term knowledge. The professionalization of engineering occurred even later. At that time and before, education and inquiry were carried out in the mechanical arts and in the liberal arts. So the software arts is also a reading of the texts of computing, of code and algorithms, technical papers that emphasizes continuities between prose and programs. Historically, it's possible to say that this position was first sketched out in the 17th century in proposal to develop artificial philosophical languages that were used to knit together the liberal arts, for example, logic, grammar, and rhetoric, the liberal arts of language, with the mechanical arts, that is, those practiced by artisans in workshops producing pins and stockings, locks, guns, and jewelry. So here's an 18th century etching of the production of pins from the French Encyclopedia. When the writings of the mechanical arts were cookbooks, these descriptions were recipes, and when they were not cookbooks, they were how-to manuals with metaphorical recipes to explain step by step how things could be made. The language of the literal and metaphorical recipes, these artificial languages, became what we know today as computer programming languages. The claim is that contemporary artificial languages have shaped and been shaped by the arts and have re-articulated the relationship between the liberal and the mechanical arts, an assembly we currently call art, design, the humanities, and technology. So programming languages are the offspring of an effort to describe the mechanical arts in the languages of the liberal arts. Writing software is a practice of writing akin to the activity of novelists, playwrights, screenwriters, speechwriters, essayists, and academics in the arts and the humanities. Consequently, contemporary education, research industry, and technology development all need to change to better recognize how the arts sit at the center of computing. While my position might strike some as radical, it is relatively well represented among some of the most influential experts in computing. For example, in an interview discussing the first Macintosh, Apple co-founder Steve Jobs said, "Part of what made the Macintosh great was that the people working on it were musicians, poets, and artists, and zoologists, and historians who also happened to be the best computer scientists in the world. And they brought with them, we all brought to this effort, a very liberal arts attitude." So in my book, The Software Arts, I argue that Jobs was right. The arts and the humanities are at the heart of computing. So Jobs doesn't just say this once. He pretty much said this at every product launch. And Jobs is not alone. There are many important computer scientists who have also put the arts and humanities at the center of computing. For instance, programming language designers are frequently advocates of treating computing as a language art. Educator, designer of the Logo programming language, and artificial intelligence co-founder Seymour Papert, in his book Mindstorms, wrote about how at the time of Plato, there was no radical split between philosophy and mathematics, and how today we need to reintegrate the humanities and the sciences. So Papert's comments give us cause to recall that the traditional liberal arts, as studied and practiced in the early modern era of Europe, included both the trivium, that's the arts of language, and the quadrivium, the arts of number. At that time, there was no strict boundary to be drawn between what today we call the arts, the humanities, and the sciences. With the book, my aim is to help erase these boundaries. For each chapter of the book, I have a hope for the reader. To begin, if the first chapter, the introduction, has worked as I wished, the reader is willing to entertain the possibility that although computing can be seen as science, for example, computer science, and as engineering, for example, software engineering, it can also be seen as an art or a collection of arts, the software arts. Chapter 2 on translation is offered as a methods chapter. Translation is known to the scholar and to the computer scientist, but each is familiar with a very different flavor of translation. The main example discussed in the chapter is a set of texts from the beginning of the theory of computation concerning Alan Turing's machines, Alonzo Church's lambda calculus, and popularizations of the Church-Turing thesis that claim that there are no limits to what a computer can do. This popularization is not true. Turing's original publication shows definitively that computers do have limits. By reading popularizations of the text of software as a series of translations, from the most technical to the most popular, I show how the popular reception of a technical text can result in a fantasy that contradicts the findings of the original publication. My hope is the reader will see how to reframe a popularization as a series of translations from the technical literature, quote, out into the wilds of popular culture, and then back again into the technical literature. The methodology presented is an amendment and an extension to actor network theory, also well known in the field of science and technology studies as the sociology of translation. And this contribution to actor network theory, or ANT for short, is the main methodological contribution of the book. Chapter 3 is entitled Language, and is the chapter that I will elaborate on in just a few minutes, so I won't summarize it here. It suffices to say that the chapter on language narrates a key theme of the book, the invention of artificial languages in the 17th century that ultimately informed the creation of what we know today as programming languages. Now, in their original form, algorithms, the topic of chapter 4, were simply a new way to do arithmetic, which arrived in Europe when merchant capitalism was a dominant force. With the rise of industrial capitalism and in today's age of financial, linguistic, and surveillance capitalism, arithmetic has gone from being economically important to becoming the beating heart of the economy. Concomitant with this rise of arithmetic in commerce and industry was its transformation into a hegemonic form of knowledge from a circumscribed liberal art, where it was one of the quadrivium, the arts of number, which also includes geometry, astronomy, and music. So originally spurred by the challenges of mathematics, over the course of the 20th century, mathematicians, linguistics, logicians, and economists reduced huge swaths of intellectual terrain to arithmetic, to calculation, in a move called arithmetization. So arithmetization presaged what we now call digitization and convergence. And these moves to centralized calculation have been environmental disasters for many fields. I contend that they're as calamitous for thought as monocrop agriculture has been to the earth's air, water, and soil. The hope for this chapter is the reader, by following a history of the algorithm from early modern Venice to the computer algorithms of today, will be given the means to stop marveling at the power of algorithms and instead begin to think beyond the current ideological limits of algorithms. To do this, one needs to understand the industrial and intellectual forces that have been applied for well over a century to translate the language arts into the liberal art of arithmetic, and once understood, to reverse these translations. The focus on chapter 5 is the liberal art of logic. The computer as logic story is often told to emphasize the many contributions of the language art of logic to the development of the computer. And I too retell that story, but include two details that are frequently occluded: materiality and history. So it complicates the computer as logic story if one admits that computers of today, with power supplies and screens and circuits, are materially very different than older works of logic printed on paper. And so material details are usually sidelined in the telling of the computer as logic story. Historical specificity is also usually marginalized in the common narrative because logic, as it is articulated today in technical venues, is not very old. First order predicate logic, as it is articulated today in technical venues, is the invention of the 20th century. Consequently, to narrate how logic begat computers becomes too complicated if one acknowledges that the logic of yesterday was a completely different animal than the logics of today. By examining a history of logic, the material specificity of logic circuits, and some of the software design techniques of logic programming, my hope is that the reader will gain insights into how one can take a seemingly unitary, monolithic technical topic, like logic, and break it down into its many disparate parts. There's no such thing as logic with a capital L, only a multitude of logics, all spelled with lowercase letters. So I just want to point out in the slide that I have up here is a letter from the semiotician and philosopher Charles Peirce to his former student, who was then the head of art and archaeology at Princeton. And this happened in 1886. He said, "Don't build your logic machine," because Alan Marquand was in the midst of building a logic machine. He said, "Don't build it out of wood, build it out of electrical circuits." And he sketches out what are two of the sort of blocks of logic circuits that we use to make digital computers today. 50 years before Claude Shannon claimed to have invented these in his electrical engineering master's thesis of 1936 at MIT. So by being a little bit more careful about looking at the history, we find these just so stories, like the idea that Claude Shannon invented Boolean circuits are actually something that's not so easy to assert or even to verify. It might have been somebody else. Let's see. So the next chapter, chapter 6, is on the second art of the trivium. That's rhetoric. And Aristotle tells us that the strongest rhetoric is closely tied to logical demonstration. This chapter traces a history of rhetorical demonstration. The history of the demo starts in ancient Greece, when definitive demonstration was a matter of deduction as practiced in geometry. Euclid's demonstration, or deductive demonstration, is displaced by inductive demonstration in the 17th century during the scientific revolution. Inductive demonstration, let's call it Robert Boyle's demonstration, was made necessary when arguments began to be based on empirical data and not just derived from statements taken to be obviously true. Today, arguments are made on the basis of so much data, big data, that no one person could possibly read it all, much less observe its collection. This has necessitated the invention of yet another form of argumentation that I term abductive demonstration, or alternatively Salmanov's and Kolmogorov's demonstration. The latest form of rhetorical demonstration is actually a kind of data compression that is otherwise known as machine learning. My point is concordant with media theorist Jonathan Stern's idea that we should now be concerned with compression rather than representation. One could say that the founding document of contemporary machine learning was Ray Salmanov's 1960 publication, A Preliminary Report on a General Theory of Inductive Inference. Employing a theorem in Salmanov's paper, Soviet mathematician Andrei Kolmogorov articulated a theory of complexity. The Kolmogorov measure of complexity of a collection of data is the length of the shortest computer program that can generate the data as output. Machine learning algorithms are designed to accept a collection of data and then search the space of computer programs to find the shortest one that is applicable. We're meant to believe that big data sets are aptly characterized by the outputs produced by machine learning algorithms, but we have no way of checking the data. So I call this an abductive demonstration because Charles Peirce, the same philosopher who invented Boolean circuits, was the one who first articulated abduction in its contemporary sense. He said that abduction is a form of guessing, or we might say more politely, abduction is a form of interpretation, a practice well known to the arts and the humanities. The chapter proceeds from older means of making a point to the newest form of persuasion. And I provide the reader with ways to both question and compose software-based arguments. So the penultimate chapter is on the third of the three liberal arts of language, specifically grammar. For a long time, grammar was a political project prosecuted as pedagogy in order to homogenize written and spoken language of empires, and then later deployed in an analogous manner to consolidate nation states. Grammar was predominantly prescriptive, and then in the late 19th century and early 20th century, grammar was reframed by linguists desiring to describe how language is actually used. With linguistic and semiotician Ferdinand de Saussure, grammar becomes descriptive. And when it did, its locus moved from textbooks into machines with mechanical and imagined mechanisms of the brain. By the mid-20th century, linguistics had joined forces with the mathematical formalism championed by David Hilbert. This resulted in a transformation of linguistics to exclude meaning from its object of study. In the words of Noam Chomsky, quote, "The study of meaning and reference and the use of language should be excluded from the field of linguistics." Instead, Chomsky and his followers pursue what they call linguistics in the form of meaningless syntactic manipulations, ultimately articulated as software. After Chomsky, grammar machines had become software, and claims were made that software could constitute a theory of language. This represents a huge shift in intellectual culture. When a computer program, a piece of software, can be a theory, we've entered what I call the computational episteme. In a computational episteme, software is taken for theoretical insight and meaning is pushed to the margins. These conditions are strange and challenging, and I hope that the reader will see that one way to make sense in a computational episteme, to remake meaning, is to act as an artist, to engage in the softer arts. Okay, so now I'm going to shift and I'm going to sort of give you an overview of one of the chapters, the chapter on language. And if, as you might remember, that's chapter 3. You've got hopefully a sort of general outline of the whole book now. And so I'm going to unfold a little bit of chapter 3 on language. And that's the place where I argue that computers are not information technologies. The operations of computing are not the functions of mathematics. So to expand on these assertions, I narrate a history of programming languages that starts in the artisans' workshops of 18th century France. I trace a history of the division of labor as it was comprised in these studios and workshops, as it was transcribed by the economist Adam Smith in the first chapter of his book, The Wealth of Nations, as Gaspard Prony revised Smith to organize large-scale calculations with human computers for post-revolutionary France, and as Charles Babbage devised a machine to embody Prony's method in his analytic engine. So that's a drawing of Babbage's analytic engine. Ada Lovelace, who used the operations of the analytic engine to write the first computer program in 1843, called this a science of operations and contrasted it with mathematical logic. So my hope is that through this history, the reader will come to understand the huge gap that separates logic and mathematics from computation and the affinity shared between computation and the kind of work that's accomplished in the arts. So let's start with what I call work languages and machine languages. I define a work language to mean the language, the text and talk employed to describe the processes and products of work. So for instance, one might scrutinize Benjamin Franklin's writings about work. Phrases like early to bed and early to rise make a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, in order to argue that the contemporary business practices, as inscribed in documents of corporate mission, legal contracts, legislation, employee manuals, and so forth, are still tied to Protestant ethics in a variety of ways. And this was, of course, Max Weber's big project. He's an early 20th century sociologist. So my assertion is that each age, each culture, each industry, each economy has one or more work languages. And by examining differences and similarities between these languages, one can interrogate what work is here and now and how it contrasts with work as it is or was there and then. Central to today's work are the almost performative qualities of machine languages, work languages employed in the design and analysis of machines. To adequately describe how a machine works is tantamount to demonstrating the work to be done in exacting detail. When a machine is designed to replace a human in a work process, the actions performed by the human must be translated into a machine language. So the work language of information is a language of calculation developed in the 18th century by a network of Enlightenment engineers, scientists, philosophers, economists, and mathematicians, including French mathematician and scientist André-Marie Ampère, Swiss scientist and mathematician Daniel Bernoulli, French engineer and scientist Charles Augustin de Coulomb, German scientist and mathematician George Simon Ohm, Italian scientist Alessandro Giuseppe Volta, and Scottish inventor James Watt. And their work language was used to translate the work of men and machines into heat or electrical charge. And thus we have the quantitative measures of the watt, the joule, and the coulomb still used today. So the French fortifications engineer Charles Augustin de Coulomb stated in the beginning of his 1775 treatise what he took to be the fundamental unit of work. He uses this unit to compare the work of machines and the work of men. Quote, "We have just seen that the effect of a machine can always be measured according to a weight multiplied by the height to which it has been raised. This measure of work, weight multiplied by the height to which it is raised, is still central to contemporary physics and structural engineering. It reduces what might be a set of very complicated movements to a single number labeled with a unit, specifically the unit of foot-pounds." Now, the formalization of this language is defined in the unit of work named for the following generation's James Prescott Joule, an English scientist and beer brewer. By the respective eponymous units, the definition of a joule relates together many of the participants of the network I listed. 1 joule, usually written as a capital J, is a unit of work equal to the expenditure of energy necessary to apply 1 Newton, that is to accelerate 1 kilogram of mass at the rate of 1 meter per second squared through a distance of 1 meter. Alternatively, a joule can be defined as passing an electric current of 1 ampere, that is 1 coulomb per second, through a resistance of 1 ohm for 1 second. Or we can understand a joule to be the heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 0.24 Kelvin, a measure of temperature named after the British physicist and engineer Lord Kelvin. So this definition can be written as an algebraic equation. The equation does far more than Coulomb's sentences of 1775. The equation succinctly relates not just weight and height, but also heat and electricity, mechanics, thermodynamics, and electrodynamics, many of the fluxes and flows investigated independently in the 18th century. So this line of research was continued through the 19th century as thermodynamics, with a practical application to, among other things, Joule's business of brewing beer, the construction of steam engines, and eventually internal combustion engines. The unit of 1 joule divided by Kelvin, that is to say a measure of work or energy divided by temperature, turned out to be pivotal for the development of thermodynamics. J over K is the unit of entropy, the measure of disorder. So who could have foreseen such a direct connection between work and disorder? Entropy is a measure of the number of ways in which a system may be arranged. That is, its measurement in a system is proportional to the number of possible states of the system. In the middle of the 20th century, Claude Shannon, here we come back to Shannon again, created a formal definition of information based on the definition of entropy. According to Shannon, entropy is equal to the average amount of information contained in a message. And this we know today as the basis for information theory. And information theory is assumed to be the foundation of information technology. So this definition of information signals its origins in the 18th century problem of measuring how much work a common laborer accomplishes lifting and carrying loads at a construction site. So the slide is for people who are philosophers and interested in Ludwig Wittgenstein because he's got some interesting things to say about this. But I'm going to illustrate this just from something that might be a common experience for many of you who took an introductory physics course. So many of us who took such an introductory physics course were struck by the absurdity of this particular work language, the one that eventually comes to be the work language of information. So let's imagine you are a house builder's apprentice and your name is Sisyphus. And in the morning, your duty is to take the builder's toolbox out of the truck and open it up. The builder climbs up to the second floor of a house under construction. And whenever he calls for a tool, Sisyphus, bring me a hammer. Your job is to get out of the toolbox, climb the ladder, give it to him, wait until he finishes the task he needed the tool for, and then to climb down the ladder again and put the tool in the toolbox. According to this definition of work, at the end of the workday, if you've performed your job well and returned all the tools back to the box, you have done no work. You lifted certain heights in the form of tools to certain to the top of the ladder, and that constitutes work. You went up the ladder with the tools, that's work, according to this definition of work that's used in physics. But you return those same weights back to the toolbox on the ground, and that constitutes negative work. Therefore, the sum total work completed by you is 0 for Sisyphus. So anticipating my conclusions for today, let's look at the plates from Diderot's encyclopedia depicting the work of an artisan pin makers. There's 3 plates in the encyclopedia describing pin makers. So, do you see men and machines lifting a lot of weight? No, right? So even if the work language of physics and information is the right one for describing coal mining and construction sites, it's not the right one for describing the work of the mechanical arts. In fact, it's absurd when employed in the pin maker's workshop. What is the appropriate work language for describing what artisans, designers, and artists do? So there's a second work language developed in the 18th century, and curiously, this history starts at the same place with some of the same people as the history of the jewel. However, the second work language is a language of the arts. Unlike the first language, the second does not ultimately collapse into a single number. Rather, this work language can be employed to describe how work is done and not just its effects. The second language anticipates what we know today as computer languages. Its history is referred to within the discipline of computer science, but rarely told in full. For example, one of the founders of the field of computer science, Herbert Simon, quipped in 1958 that physicists and engineers had little to do with the invention of the digital computer. The real inventor, says Simon, was the economist Adam Smith. So what's Simon referring to? Recall that in Book 1, Chapter 1 of Adam Smith's best-known work, The Wealth of Nations, is on the division of labor. Smith wrote, the greatest improvements in the productive power of labor and the greater part of skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it is anywhere directed or applied seem to have been the effects of the division of labor. Clearly then, Herbert Simon is suggesting that we examine how work and the division of labor are at the core of the computer. Central to Adam Smith's discussion on the division of labor is an examination of how pins are made. Smith's description, I want to point out, is in an entirely different kind of language than the first work language I just described. Adam Smith's work language has its beginnings in a set of drawings that I just showed you, detailing a workshop producing pins in a little town in Normandy, L'Aigle, France. So the engineer, Jean-Rudolph Perronnet, did the original observation work at this site. And let's call the observational work anachronistically ethnographic work so that we can be reminded of the importance of contemporary human scientists, especially ethnographers' contribution to the design of software and hardware. Trained in civil engineering, mathematics, and mechanics, Perronnet joined the engineering corps of the Pont et Chaussée in 1735. Soon thereafter, he was appointed the chief engineer for the district of Alençon and was primarily concerned with the construction and paving of roads. But during the same period, Perronnet studied the workshops of artisans and craftsmen. He wrote 2 manuscripts on the manufacture of pins by this workshop in the nearby town of Leyden. While neither of these manuscripts was immediately published, Perronnet contributed the entry for pin to Diderot and d'Alembert's 18th century encyclopedia. Moreover, Perronnet's detailed descriptions of how the craftsmen manufactured the pins, how they used their machines, how the machines were designed, anticipated the work language and the machine language of the encyclopedia, a collection that incorporated many articles on contemporary methods of craft and production. So the encyclopedia, if you never had a look at it, 18th century multi-volume thing, really was a maker's reference book. How stuff got made in France at the time. Diderot and d'Alembert sent people all over France to all these workshops, all these artists and artisans workshops to figure out like how stuff was made. And that's what's the big chunk of what's in the encyclopedia. So the design historian Antoine Picon discusses the 3 main terms of this work language of the encyclopedia, right? They sent these people all over France, they bring them back, and they all have descriptions using the vocabulary that they used in the little workshop, let's say in Normandy, but that clashes with the little workshop somewhere else in Paris, let's say. And so they have to invent a new language that they can use to describe all of these different things, how they get made, what the machines are, and what might be called one thing in one workshop might be called another thing. So they got to standardize in another. So they need to standardize these vocabularies. And the way they did this is they focused on sort of 3 main terms in order to write these encyclopedia articles. The 3 main terms are gestures, operations, and processes. And Picon says, the common threads that connect the different articles devoted to the arts and the crafts are the description of elementary gestures of production, how these movements are integrated and thereby define aggregate technical operations, the logic and chaining together these operations to form processes organized according to a division of labor. The encyclopedia repeatedly emphasizes the benefits of the division of labor. Gestures, operations, processes, this triad was applied to the description of the fabrication of stockings, of pins or ropes, extraction of iron ore and its refinement. The notion of operation occupies a central position in this framework. It's a kind of basic semantic unit, says Picon, that underlies the know-how of individuals and the logic of the entire chain of production. From individual movement to process chain, the thread that weaves them together is analogous to the overall aim of Diderot, d'Alembert, and their encyclopedia collaborators, the integration of all forms of knowledge. So central to the story of the encyclopedia's work language is a set of writings about the division of labor. 19th century analyses of the division of labor moved quickly from physical industrial labor to mental labor, especially the labor of calculation. So after Perronnet visiting the pin makers and so forth, the history continues with Adam Smith's reading of d'Alembert and Diderot's encyclopedia. So his opening chapter of The Wealth of Nations is based on a reading of the encyclopedia. So then, just a few years after that, in 1791, Gaspard Prony, charged by the French government to produce a set of enormous and detailed logarithmic and trigonometric tables, borrowed back from Adam Smith this image of the division of labor, claiming that he could, quote, manufacture logarithms as easily as one manufactures pins. Pony organized a great number of working class non-mathematicians to perform as a set of computers in order to calculate the table. So keep in mind that computer at the time, in fact, all the way up until 1936, mid-1940s, computer meant a person who held the job of calculating. So if you've all seen the film Hidden Figures, all those folks in Hidden Figures their job title is computer. So there is, however, some sort of Oedipal perversity in Pony's claim that he was inspired by Smith, because Smith's source is obviously, ultimately, Diderot's encyclopedia, and yet Perronnet was not just Pony's professor, his mentor, his supervisor, and eventual collaborator, but also his predecessor as the first director of the École des Ponts et Chaussées, still a very important engineering school in France. So Pony succeeded him as director in 1798. This unlikely detour through Scotland, through the writings of Adam Smith, that connects the genealogy of computing from Perronnet to Pony, is the source of computer scientist and Nobel Prize-winning economist Herbert Simon's quip that Smith was the inventor of the computer. So it takes a little unpacking. You get this in little snippets if you're reading computer science very closely, but it takes a little unpacking to figure out, well, what did Herbert Simon mean when he said that? So then sort of the connection to our times is pretty straightforward. A few years after Pony's achievement, British mathematician, philosopher, and engineer Charles Babbage noted how Pony's division of labor could be incorporated as a machine. And in my preferred terms, Babbage thus translated the work language of the encyclopedia into a machine language. He achieved this in plan, but not in physical form. His analytic engine was too expensive to build and required parts that exceeded the precision the tool makers of his time could readily make. But nonetheless, even on the drawing board, it became clear that the machine language he forged out of the encyclopedia's work language is from a very different family than logic or mathematics. So he actually invented these graphical languages to describe machines. And this is an example of that. The differences really appear in Babbage's drawings, and historian Mark Priestley tells us, quote, "In the course of his work, Babbage found that the traditional method of using drawings to describe machinery was inadequate. A drawing could only represent the state of a machine in one instance, and so provided little assistance in understanding the sequences of movements involved in a complex mechanism or in working out the appropriate timing of the movements of its interacting parts." And so consequently, Babbage was driven to invent a new graphical notation for machines that combined textual annotation and the illustration of the structure of the parts of the machine with a novel means to describe the succession of movements that were to take place in the machine. And in terms of the encyclopedia, Babbage had to work out how to describe gestures, operations, and the sequences of movements and operations, that is to say, processes. So as Picon, the design historian, pointed out, operations were at the semantic foundations of the encyclopedia's work language. And soon after Babbage completed his design, it became clear that operations were central to his machine language too. Ada Lovelace, the English mathematician, elucidated the differences between the operations of Babbage's machine and the functions of arithmetic and calculation. She argued that Babbage's machine would require a new field of research beyond mathematics, a field she called a science of operations. Quote, "The science of operations is a science unto itself and has its own abstract truth and value, just as logic has its own peculiar truth and value, independently of the subjects to which we may apply its reasonings and processes." So because of her writings on Babbage's machine, Lovelace is acknowledged to be the first computer programmer, the first software designer, and key issues she identifies concerning the rendering and execution of operations are still concerns of contemporary computer science. So the first language I described is a language of functions. The second is a language of operations. And research in art and design is an issue of revising and extending operations because art and design is expressed and practiced in a work language of operations and not of mathematical functions. So what's the difference between a function and an operation? One can see in the Oxford English Dictionary that prior to the German philosopher and mathematician Leibniz, the term function was a very general term, meaning, for example, official duties or the kind of action proper to a person as belonging to a particular class. And these are quite general terms applicable to all kinds of work. After Leibniz, however, a new, more specialized mathematical definition is introduced. Quote, and I'm quoting from the, from the Oxford English Dictionary, quote, a variable quantity regarded in its relation to one or more other variables in terms of which it may be expressed. This use of Latin functio is due to Leibniz and his associates. So thus the language of work as jewels is part and parcel with the 18th century movement in engineering to recast engineering analysis and design into the language of Leibniz and Newton's calculus. Looking to the OED again for the definition of operation, we can see that it too was and still is a general term applicable to the description of all kinds of work. Definition 1A is the exertion of force or influence, working activity, a manner of working, the way in which a thing works. Operation contrasted with function. As Picon emphasizes, one must observe that although quantification and mathematical calculation could be considered as the quintessence of analysis, the analytical method of the encyclopedia could very well remain qualitative. In other words, the work language of functions is quantitative, the work language of operations can be purely qualitative. So let's rush this history forward about a century to 1947. And in 1947, Hermann Goldstein and John von Neumann published Planning and Coding for an Electronic Instrument at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. A text we might read today as the first ever computer programming manual. Goldstein and von Neumann were trying to describe coding, that is, programming, for a readership that was completely unfamiliar with the notion. They framed the programming as an issue of translating mathematical formulas into the language of the computer. Yet they were not comfortable with the notion that it was a form of translation. They seemed to feel like the rewriting of mathematical formulas into computer language was much more difficult than translating from one language into another. And they wrote, quote, the relation of coded instruction sequence to the mathematically conceived procedure for numerical solution is not a statical one, that of translation, but highly dynamical. A coded order stands not simply for its present contents at its present location, but more fully for any succession of passages through it. In other words, there is yet another difference between these operations and mathematical functions. The operations can change their order, their number, or their kind as execution of the program proceeds. So the exposition of Goldstein and von Neumann hinges on their development of the then newest graphical means of diagramming a machine, the flow diagram. It merits a comparison to Babbage's notations and the drawings made of machines for the encyclopedia. Software is still frequently designed in a graphical notation that bears a strong resemblance to Goldstein and von Neumann's flow diagrams. And if we keep this history of the work language of operations in mind, and if we peer closely into the core of the computer, we can look back in time to see a small pin maker's workshop in 18th century Normandy. But the workshop we see is empty. No one is there. Okay, there's the old slides of the pin maker. You can see plenty of people there. But By the time we get here, they're gone. When we compare them to the encyclopedia's engravings, let's just go back, make my point. No people, people. When we compare them to the encyclopedia's engraving, it is the lack of people that is most striking in von Neumann's flow diagrams. This is a picture of work without workers. This is a picture, this picture is at the vanishing point of automation, where all workers have been ejected from the workshop and replaced by machines. So something of the work language of operations was lost as it was translated through the centuries, from Perronnet to Smith to Prony to Babbage, and then to von Neumann and Goldstein. And what was lost in the language was the facility to include people, or more specifically, what was lost in translation was the interactions between people and between people and machines. This then is the grand challenge for art and design research under computational conditions. How do we put people back into the picture? How do we rewrite the language of operations to include interactions? So that's what I have to say about my book tonight. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about the pause there, everybody. We're still figuring out this technology. My name is Mike Reepy, and along with David Hansen, I'm one of the co-organizers of this series. So thank you, Professor Sachs. We're going to take some Q&A right now. So we do have some questions building up in the Q&A panel here. If you have another question, please type it in the box. And I think our first question, we're going to, and what we're going to do, I'll read your name and we'll unmute you. And if you could go ahead and just ask your question yourself. So I think we're going to start with Tom Dayton. You have it says here, not a question, but a probe for thoughts. But so we're going to unmute you, and why don't you go ahead. You also had a second question, which you can ask about where to get the book.
Hi. Sorry, I've been having cocktails, so I may be a little slurry. This
So
is
am I.
props and pints, so, you know, whatever. This is not really a question, but it's a probe, because in fact I just gave a lecture remotely to my alma mater, New College in Florida, and to a software engineering class, and my #1 slide was, your job is not to write code, it is to meet requirements. And that includes collaborating with representative sample of all the other stakeholders, including users, but others, to figure out what the heck the requirements should be. And by requirements, I'm using that term broadly: vision, needs, goals, objectives, stories, whatever. So that sounds to me like a lot of what you're talking about. It's more about, I call it craft rather than art. It includes design. It includes figuring out how not to write code. Like, oh, we should not write this code. Comments? That was a probe, not a question.
Well, first of all, part of what I do in titling my book is use an older definition of art. Art used to include arts and crafts. So I'm not in disagreement with you there at all. And neither am I in disagreement with you about what those of us who write software should be doing, which is collaborating as much as possible rather than coding all the time. You know, the main way I have of thinking about what's happening to our world is that many things are getting translated from the material, physical interactions of everyday life into code. So Zoom is a perfect example of this, right? I mean, we've all changed so that conversation is much more likely to be via Zoom rather than to be face-to-face. And that is mediated by an awful lot of software. So what we're really trying to think about, I guess to put it in Silicon Valley terms, we're trying to figure out what kind of a disruption is this? That is to say, we have everyday institutions that are social, political, so for that, I'm using institutions as a social scientist might use that word, but to say anything could be an institution. It's the rules of interaction, really. So we have institutions for telling a story to our children. We have institutions for how to buy oranges at the farmer's market. We have institutions about that are as big as the Constitution of the United States. But they're all really a vocabulary of social, political, economic interaction. And when we introduce a piece of software, we're disrupting that in some ways. And that we need to figure that out. And there are some sort of intrinsic limits to what can be expressed in code. So we've got to figure out how to do the best translation that we can if what we're doing is in good faith, I guess.
Okay, thank you for the question. Our second question is from Christopher Nelson. So we'll unmute you and go ahead.
Hi, yes. I was kind of curious. Some of the early math logic was happening in India and China. And but it tends to be when we have these discussions, we focus more on the Greeks, where a lot of our series of processes, if this, do this, or not this, A, do the B sort of processes actually come from those early, that early logic work. Why do we tend to not really talk about that side of the logic development in terms of mathematician?
Well, I'm strictly an amateur in this, but from what I understand, I mean, what, for example, Panini was working on in about 300 BC in India, he was working on a grammar of Sanskrit, but the grammar of Sanskrit expressed in what we would recognize today as, a formalism, a metagrammar, that is to say, a formalism that wasn't just specific to Sanskrit. It could do a lot of other things. And it included a lot of things like conditionals. It had looping and recursion. It had more or less everything that we needed. And my friend John Kadvani, John wrote a really interesting paper, I guess it was 2 years ago now, in which he shows that Panini's logic from 300 BC is essentially the same thing as Emil Post came up with in the 1920s, 1930s. And so Post isn't celebrated as the inventor of computation just because he was very quiet about what he was doing. And Church and Turing sort of tend to get the lion's share of that. But really what Post came up with in his production systems was something that A, is pretty much equivalent to this 300 BC work by Panini, and B, is computationally as expressive as any modern computer. So there's, I think in terms of the Western tradition, though, when I look at the history of logic through the Western tradition, in the sense, in multiple senses, because 300 BC to 1920, well, Post wasn't reading Panini either. Panini doesn't really come into at least American academia until like 1960, when we can see Chomsky talking about that as well. But it just wasn't recognized as as equivalent to, let's say, what Aristotle was writing about in terms of logic. So it's, you know, the touchstones of humanities scholarship about logic. Just Panini is a latecomer, despite the fact that he was the earliest.
Thank you. Our third question is from our next month speaker, actually, PK Agarwal. Could somebody unmute PK?
Okay, I think I'm. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, wonderful. First of all, great talk. Very, very interesting historic perspective. I guess it got me thinking, especially if I come from a tech background, and I'm witness to massive amounts of not only bad code, but entire systems that are, really have no social conscience at all. So I guess I got me thinking that how do we, practically speaking, how do we attract more people from the humanities and artists to come to computer science, to get into that industry, so we bring some soul into it?
Well, so I didn't originally write this book, and the motivations for writing this book was really a set of interactions with my students. And my students are in some in engineering, but mostly in the arts, because my department, film and digital media, is in the arts. And what my intuitions told me was that a lot of these core ideas about computation come from the arts. And the reason why that was pedagogically really important for me to tell my students is because even my students who are in digital arts, they're coming in to get their MFA in digital arts, oftentimes they'll say to me when they're taking a introduction to programming the arts class from me, they'll say, this really doesn't have anything to do with me. You know, I come from the studio, I come from the workshop, my background is in the arts. This computer stuff doesn't have anything to do with me. And what I argue in the classroom is, yes, it does. It has a lot to do with you. You just have to find that connection between the arts and computing. It's really solidly there. There's all of these really important computer scientists. I mean, think about Donald Knuth, who named his multi-volume work The Art of Computer Programming. There's many important computer scientists who have said that there's this intrinsic connection between the arts and computation. So the book is kind of a trace of me going through the historical record and saying, okay, how do I make a really solid philosophical, historical argument that connects these two together? Something that my intuition tells me, and something that is absolutely essential for the classroom, which is to tell the students, no, this is really connected to the arts. And so I think that is, I think that's important to teaching, is to explain how these connections between arts and computation are there, because I find, especially teaching art students computing, I find the examples make all the difference, right? If you ask them to find the first 1,000 primes, they could care less. But if you ask them to reconstruct a piece of conceptual art using computer graphics, they're much more engaged. So I don't know. I guess I'm just thinking about it in terms of the classroom, but I think there's obviously issues all through academia and industry about how do we get a wider, more diverse population engaged. And I think it's got to speak to people. I think people have to know that this stuff actually connects to things that they really care about.
Sorry, I was still on mute. So our next question is from one of our regulars, David Cohen, and he actually, this is perfect timing because it looks like he has a follow-up question about Knuth. So David, take it away.
Well, let's see. Have I successfully unmuted myself here?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. So number one, thank you, Warren. I enjoyed every bit of that. I learned computer programming, computer science, and the art of programming at Santa Cruz about 40 years ago. And I also enjoy the view of the bike path I used to come down. So thank you.
You recognize it. Excellent.
Oh, absolutely. Great memories. Yeah, I had, before you mentioned Donald Knuth and the art of computer programming, I had typed in a question asking, and maybe I should say now, elaborate on the connection of his choice of and his intent of the use of that word that is a seminal tome of computer programming with how you're using the word art.
So I think, it's not just Knuth. There's lots of others who say that that computing is an art. When Knuth says that, though, if you look at the beginning of the first volume, he says, I almost called this a recipe book for software, I think he says, but I resisted. And you realize that many others in his area of specialty, the analysis of algorithms, right, which he has essentially invented, many others who work in the analysis of algorithms regularly draw the analogy between algorithms and recipes. And by recipes, I mean cooking recipes. And so this is the connection to the arts. Recipes, as we know them today, were invented in the 18th century, pretty much. It wasn't a common practice for cooks to write down how they make stuff, right? The way you'd get trained as a cook is you'd go apprentice in a kitchen and you'd learn how to make all the dishes that particular chef knew how to make. And that was it. There wasn't a literature of it. And then we get to about the 18th century, and this is almost exactly the moment of the French encyclopedia, when people, that is to say cooks, start writing down how to make their stuff. And they have a huge, they suddenly have a huge audience for this, because many people want to know how those famous chefs in restaurants make stuff, or the chefs who are more or less servants to royalty and so forth. And so the first big seller was La Cuisinière Bourgeoise, was sort of a 1840s book, and a 1740s book, I'm sorry. And this is more or less what we find in the encyclopedia. All of these craft recipes. So it's not just about food, though. There are recipes like for how to make a pin, how to make a stocking, how do all this stuff get made? And I think Knuth is exactly referencing what I'm talking about, which is art as it was understood prior to the mid-19th century, which it included both arts and crafts.
Thank you. Mike Casper, question, could somebody please unmute Mike?
Unmute myself. Okay, am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay, great. Hey, Warren, thank you so much for the talk. It reminds me a little bit of a book I read a while back, Where the Wizards Stay Up Late, The Origins of the Internet. And I always love sort of these kind of Genesis and Genesis stories in terms of, telling us how we got to the place that we are today. Can you talk a little bit about the future? Can you talk about the reintegration of the arts and sciences and how you think that might happen and what that might look like?
Well, I'm very hopeful for it happening around software. There are a lot of people who do software design who see themselves as artists and craftsmen. Just search for, you know, something like recipes in C, recipes in C++, recipes in Python, recipes in JavaScript. And, you know, there are entire sort of almost professional organizations now where people are really talking about the craft of programming. Actually, one thing I was supposed to do last week was go to a big conference on sort of programming and craft. And so I think, you know, for me, the connection is best made when people see the problems. Let me just start by saying that this notion of the two cultures, right, that Snow talked to us about in the 1950s, the idea that the arts were on one side and technology and science were on the other side. There was this two culture discourse that continues on. We kind of ends up trying to put ourselves in one basket or the other basket, but that can be overcome in many ways by individuals who find that there's affinities across that divide, both in terms of technique. So I think it's not that unusual if you read computer science very closely for people to talk about translation, many different kinds of things as being translations, and that's one little slice of a much bigger practice in the humanities of translation. And also just in terms, as I was saying before, compelling problems. Are the problems really compelling? So we're being forced in many ways also, not just as individuals, but as entire institutions, as more and more stuff goes online, right? I mean, a place like Netflix is intrinsically retranslating our culture to us because, I mean, I'm chair of the film and digital media department. Film is a completely different animal now that Netflix has it streaming to us. We don't think of it as that different than going down to get a DVD from Blockbuster, but it's a huge difference in many ways. And so there are a lot of people who are working as software people in what are really cultural institutions, even if they don't see themselves that way. I know Netflix does not, but they are, and vice versa. There's a lot of people doing culture. I mean, as an artist, so I'm a writer, but I'm also an artist. I show my work, which is more or less software art. I write software and then it gets shown in museums. There's a lot of artists who are also working on the other direction as well. So across everything, I don't know, but this is a problem for individuals. It's a problem for institutions to build a bridge between these cultures. But it's also really, and I'm going to bring it back to the university again, it's a problem of education, because these things in our country and in many other countries as well have been separated out, have been, you know, if you go to UCSC, you cannot get a degree for a certain craft, like being a mechanic, right? You can't learn how to fix cars at UC Santa Cruz. You can learn the theory of thermodynamics and things like that and do a bunch of sort of hands-on things, but nobody's going to let you fix their Tesla, because that's another route in education. So that has to be overcome as well. And there I see hope in sort of new programs like in my department, film and digital media, like in the MFA program I teach in, the digital arts and new media, like my colleagues with whom I spend a lot of time in engineering, in this new department called computational media.
Okay, thank you for that question. We have some follow-up questions for a few people, but there was one short question about ways to get your book, Professor Sachs, especially not having to go through Amazon. Maybe it's at Bookshop Santa Cruz or somewhere. And then we're going to go to a last question from Stephanie, another one of our regulars, and then I'll need a few minutes to wrap up.
Okay, so if you want to get it directly from MIT Press, that's easy to do on the site. Bookshop Santa Cruz and the Literary Guillotine downtown in Santa Cruz had it until last fall, and I don't know whether Bookshop Santa Cruz still has copies or not. I would say go to the MIT Press bookstore. That will be the most expedient thing to do today. I think you might also be able to get it through the Bookshop Santa Cruz website, but actually I haven't tried that.
So yeah, last question from Stephanie. Take it away, Steph. And then we'll need you can answer this in about 3 minutes, Professor Sachs.
Thank you so much for the talk, Professor Sachs. That was really rich and wonderful. I come from the humanities side, so it's a really refreshing topic to have for rebalancing, call for rebalancing. My original question was sort of related to your discussion about the future and what you see as potentially exciting examples of disruption of this kind of pattern of disappearing people and transactions and things like that. But I'm kind of wanting to go into the direction that you just kind of touched on, which is the education bit. And your talk was so rich in kind of drawing the fine line between the two now, kind of poles that we have, and kind of tracing back to where, those poles develop. And so I wonder, if you could speak a little bit more about what you see as needed in the education. So to my mind, kind of historicization is a really crucial bit of that. But could you talk a little bit more about what you see as wanting to, like, how do you want to intervene in terms of educating folks to commit to this this kind of work? Thank you.
Well, it's oftentimes the business model for a lot of companies in Silicon Valley that are going to disrupt an industry, right? So Uber disrupts taxi cabs. Amazon disrupts books, and now many other things. Netflix disrupts film and so forth. So what exactly are they disrupting? Well, there's kind of a bigger perspective of that. And I think the business aim is to have, money for Amazon. The business aim is to have money that's going into local bookstores, going to Seattle, to it as well. But the way that that's done, I think is applicable, even if you don't like Amazon, to a variety of other things. It's changing our everyday interactions. And this is acknowledged in the educational system around really to the fields of human-computer interaction and computer-supported cooperative work, where the basic unit, if you will, of analysis and design is the interaction, and it's not the algorithm. So what, Donald Knuth, for all the good things he's done, he's also cemented, starting with the first ACM directive on what a computer science curriculum should look like for a college, that was published in 1968, all the way until the latest one, which was 2013. The curriculum has been really circulating around algorithms, but what we need is a basic analysis, which is now seen as relatively marginal, insofar as you can see as human-computer interaction as marginal. That's not entirely the case, but how do we think about interactions, changing these everyday interactions, and whether or not we should be changing them is the ethics of it, and not just to change them, to disrupt them in order to make more money. We want to think about how changing these interactions, putting them into a new materiality, right? Putting them into something where we push buttons and we look at a screen, rather than going places or talking to people face to face, or actually exchanging, let's say, we exchange credit card numbers rather than exchanging cash. So we need a really clear notion of what these interactions down at the really micro level are.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Professor Sachs. And thank you, everybody. We're hitting on the 8 o'clock hour, so we need to wrap up. I see we do have a few more follow-up questions from some other people, and I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to those. We were a bit unsure how Q&A was going to go with this new Zoom platform for us, but I think that went pretty smoothly. So yeah, thanks for all your wonderful questions, and thanks for being with us tonight. I also want to thank Professor Sachs for joining us. Yeah.
If people want, if people want to send me email, I'm happy to answer questions on email too.
And your email address?
WSACK, W-S-A-C-K @UCSC.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
There you go.
And I just want to point out, a few people have asked, but I'll point out again, this talk has been recorded on Zoom. It's going to be available on the UC Santa Cruz Arts and Lectures YouTube channel. I think we'll have a link to that and the email goes out. And if you do have any other, any words of appreciation for Warren's talk tonight, you can add those in the comments or the Q&A section, and he'll get those. And just a few organizational words about campus and about the next talk. We have mentioned a few times in the past few months the UCSC Giving Day that we raise funds for. I think many alumni know that Giving Day has been canceled because of COVID. Instead, we have a lot of students who are really in critical need of support for food and housing and maybe technology to help them take online classes. UCSC, we're kind of dropping most of our fundraising to concentrate on a single fund, which is fundraising for COVID support. It's called the Slug Support Campaign. We encourage you to contribute to that fund and give generously if you can. There will be a URL for that in the follow-up email that goes out. I also like to give a big round of thanks to the staff members who helped us organize this Zoom conference. These are from the Alumni Office and the Special Events Office. A big thank you to, and applause to Cara, Haley, and Kristen. Thank you very much. Our next event will be Monday, May 11th. We're going to feature the Dean of UCSC Silicon Valley Extension and questioner tonight, PK Agarwal. He's going to discuss a very topical subject, Emerging from the Job Market Chaos, A More Successful You is the title. It builds on the recognition that out of every crisis emerges opportunities. PK was the founding CEO and Dean of Northeastern University in Silicon Valley. He's also served as CEO of TIE Global, a multinational nonprofit dedicated to the growth of entrepreneurship. And he was appointed the Chief Technology Officer for the state of California by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's known for, to quote one colleague, an uncanny ability to identify, assess, and integrate current and future IT trends, which he then merges into his responsibilities for education strategies. So join us in about a month for our next, I was about to say Prof and Pint, but slugs and mugs. Oh, Slugs and Signs, I'm sorry. That was one or the other. I'd also like to mention one more talk you might be interested in. Some of you are familiar with the CRAW lecture series from UCSC. And this particular one is going to focus on viruses and vaccines, also very topical right now. Professor Rebecca Dubois, who was, I think, our second speaker in the Prof and Pint lecture series, she studies how viruses cause infections and identifies weaknesses that can be targeted with vaccines and antiviral therapies. This talk will be on April 28th at 7 p.m. We'll also send you a link to that in the email, or you can go to the UCSC events calendar. I think it's events.ucsc.edu. And finally, let me just wrap up by thank you for joining us tonight for our first virtual event. Please come back on May 11th for another Prof and Pint talk, or Slugs and Steins talk. So good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Round of applause.